What if your life looks right but feels wrong? That is what we're talking about in today's episode of the MindShift Show. Welcome. My name is Pamela E. Bloomfield. I help professional women over 40 who have everything else figured out except themselves, so they can stop performing success, unbury their purpose, and start living it from the inside out. Guided by my ICAN framework and AI-supported reflections to make clarity come faster and easier. Have you ever looked at your life and thought, on paper, this should feel better than it actually does? Because that is the space so many women like you are living in right now. Everything looks fine from the outside. You have the responsibilities, and they're totally handled. You've built a life. You've succeeded in ways you were supposed to. You may even be the woman other people look at and think she really has it together. But inside, something feels off. Not in a dramatic crisis level kind of way. Not in a loud, I'll call it falling apart kind of way. Just a quiet disconnect. A subtle ache inside. A feeling that you're moving through your days, but not fully feeling yourself in them. And if this is you, I want to say something right away. And I've always been saying this to you, but I wanted to sink really deep down today in today's episode for you. And that is, you are not broken. You are not behind. And certainly, you are not the only one feeling this way, although sometimes it feels so. In fact, this is far more common than most people realize, because a lot of women have built lives that look successful on the outside, while privately feeling disconnected on the inside. And that gap, that space between outward success and inner truth is where a lot of confusion begins. So today, I want to talk about that gap. Not just what it looks like, but why it happens, why it feels so hard to name, and how you begin moving from vague to visible, so you can actually, I love this part, hear yourself again. Because that is where clarity starts. One of the hardest things about this season of life is that it does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it comes as a feeling you can't really explain. You still show up. You still do what needs to get done. You still take care of everybody and everything around you. But somewhere in the middle of all that competence, you start feeling far away from yourself. You may not even know how to describe it at first. You just know things do not feel as satisfying as they used to. What used to energize you now feels heavy. What used to motivate you now feels empty. What used to feel like progress now feels like performance. And that can be deeply confusing. I get it. Because if your life looks fine, you start wondering if you're being ungrateful. If you're restless, you wonder if you're being dramatic. And if you're dissatisfied, you wonder if maybe the problem is you. But I want to offer you a different perspective. Maybe the problem is not that you are ungrateful. Maybe the problem is not that you are dramatic. Maybe the problem is simply that you have outgrown a version of your life that no longer fits who you are becoming. And that is not failure. That is evolution. Why it feels so hard to name? A lot of women I speak to are not unclear because they do not know anything. They are unclear because they know too much. They know how to hold things together. They know how to meet expectations. They know how to be strong, dependable, and capable. They know how to keep going even when they are tired. What they do not always know is how to stop long enough to hear what they actually want. And that matters. That matters. Because if you have spent years being the woman who figures it out, who carries it, who manages it, who shows up for everyone else, then it makes sense that your own desires might feel a little faint. Not gone, just buried under responsibility, buried under habit, or buried under performance. That's why a question like, what do you want? I've asked so many women that question, what do you want? And it can feel surprisingly hard to answer. Not because you have no desires, but because your inner voice has not had enough space to speak clearly, no space for you to listen to yourself. And when that happens, life can start to feel vague. It's not necessarily bad, it's just vague. You know something needs to change. You just can't tell what it is. You just can't put your finger on it. You know something feels off, but you just can't name where. You know that you want more. You just can't define what more means. Does that sound familiar? And that is where the real process begins. One of the most powerful shifts a woman can make is moving from vague to visible. Because the vague keeps everything fuzzy. You know what I mean? It sounds like something is off. You may say, I'm not happy, but I'm not sure why. I'm tired, I'm stuck, and I feel stuck. I don't know what I want. I know I need to change, but I can't figure out what kind of change. And when things start, or when they stay vague, they stay hard to move. But visible? Visible creates room for truth. Visible sounds like, I am overextending myself. I have been performing enough. I have been performing strength. I am disconnected from what matters to me now. I have outgrown some of the roles I've been playing. I do not want to keep living this way. That kind of language changes everything. Because once you can name what is happening, you're no longer just carrying it. You begin to understand it. And once you understand it, you can work with it. That is the shift. Not from perfection to perfection, not from confusion to instant certainty or clarity, just from vague to visible, from something feels off to here is what I'm actually feeling, from I don't know how to I can at least see it now, from I'm lost to I'm beginning to hear myself again. That is where clarity begins. So many of you that I've spoken with, so many women are exhausted, not because they're doing too much. Or I should say, not because they're doing too little, right? But because they're doing too much. But because disconnection from themselves makes them feel like they're performing success, and they really are. And performing success can look very impressive from the outside. It can look like always being on, always being available, always being strong, always being productive, always looking put together, always keeping everything moving. But the cost is high. Because when you are constantly performing, you are rarely pausing to ask whether the life you're building is still aligned with the woman you are becoming. And over time, that mismatch, as I call it, starts to wear on you. You may feel it in your body. You may feel it in your emotions. You may feel it in your relationships. You may feel it in your work. You may just feel it as a general sense that something is missing. And sometimes the loss is dramatic. Sometimes it is slow. A little less joy, a little less energy, a little less honesty, a little less access to yourself. Until one day you realize that you have been functioning in a life that looks right, but no longer feels right. And that realization can be uncomfortable. But it can also be the beginning of everything. Because once you notice the disconnect, you can no longer unsee it. Got that? It's now staring you in the face. And that awareness is not meant to shame you. It is meant to invite you back to yourself. A lot of people think that clarity means having a perfect answer. It does not. Clarity is not always a dramatic moment where everything becomes obvious all at once. More often, clarity is what happens when you finally slow down enough to hear the truth underneath all the noise. Clarity sounds like, I'm tired of pretending I'm fine. I want something different. I don't want to keep living by default. I want to feel like myself again. I don't need to have the entire plan, as they say, see the entire staircase. But I do need to be honest. That is clarity. Clarity is not certainty about everything. It is honesty about what is no longer working for you. It is a willingness to notice what drains you, what lights you up, what feels heavy, what feels true, what you've outgrown, what you're still trying to force. And many women, for them, that is the first real turning point. Because once you begin telling the truth about your life, you begin to see it differently. And once you see it differently, you can choose differently. One of the reasons this work I do matters so much is because Many of you have gotten so used to listening to everybody else that you no longer trust your own voice. And so you've spent years hearing what you should want, what you should do, what success should look like, what a good woman should be able to handle, what a strong woman should tolerate, what an accomplished woman should keep pushing through. And after a while, all those external voices get louder than the internal one. So when your own voice starts trying to rise, it may feel unfamiliar. You're just not used to that. It may even feel inconvenient because your truth is not always tidy. Your truth is not always predictable. Your truth is not always easy. But it is yours. It's your truth. And the more you ignore it, the more disconnected you feel. The more you listen to it, the more grounded you become. That is why the real work is not about becoming someone new. And I've always said that. You have all the experience under your belt. It is about hearing yourself clearly enough to stop abandoning the woman you already are. And so for many women over 40, this season of life brings a different kind of questioning. You may have done the things you were supposed to do. You may have built the career, the family, the reputation, the stability. You may have checked all the boxes. And now the question shifts. Not how do I become successful, but what does success mean now? Not how do I prove myself, but what actually matters to me now? Not how do I do all the things, but what am I willing or what am I no longer willing to do at the expense of myself? That is why this season, your season, can feel disorienting. The old goals may not fit anymore. The old definitions may not fit anymore. The old version of you may not fit anymore. And that can feel unsettling if you think you're supposed to stay the same. But growth, my friend, does not ask you to stay the same. It tells you the truth about who you are now. And that truth may be quieter, deeper, and more honest than the version of you that got praised for holding everything together. There are a few things that keep women stuck, women over 40. Keep them stuck in this in-between space. First, that word fear. Fear of change, fear of disappointing people, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of discovering that the life you built is not the life you want anymore. And then second, there is loyalty. Loyalty to roles and loyalty to expectations and loyalty to old identities, loyalty to being the strong one. Then third, there is habit. Because even when something is misaligned, familiar can still feel safer than unknown. I'll say that again. Familiar can still feel safer than unknown. That is why women over 40 stay stuck. Not because they are incapable, not because they're lazy, not because they do not care. They stay stuck because the truth requires a new level of honesty, and honesty can feel vulnerable. But vulnerability is also where freedom begins. Moving forward does not mean you have to blow up your life. It does not mean you need a dramatic reinvention overnight. It means you start paying attention. You start noticing where you feel alive and where you feel drained. You start noticing where you are shrinking and where you are expanding. You start noticing what you keep avoiding and what keeps you tugging at you. And then you start asking better questions. Not what should I do, but what feels true? What am I no longer available for? That's a tough one. What do I want more of? What do I want less of? What would it look like to live in a way that feels aligned? Those questions matter because they move you from survival mode into self-awareness. And self-awareness is the beginning of real change. It is. And so if you're listening to this episode and feeling a little exposed, I want you to take that seriously. Because not because anything is wrong with you, but because there is something inside of you that may be trying to get your attention. So just for a moment, just for a minute, ask yourself, where in my life do I feel successful but disconnected? Where am I performing instead of participating? Where have I been vague with myself because the truth feels hard to face? What have I outgrown? What part of me is asking to be heard? And remember, I said you do not have to answer those questions perfectly. You just have to be willing to ask them honestly, because clarity often begins with a question, not an answer. If your life looks right but feels wrong, that does not mean you have failed. It means your inner truth is asking for a voice. And so if you feel successful but disconnected, that does not mean that you are ungrateful. It means something in you is ready for a deeper kind of alignment. If you do not know exactly what you want yet, that does not mean you are lost. It just means you may need some space, some reflection, and support to hear yourself clearly. And that is okay. Remember, you do not need to have it all figured out today. You do not need to make every decision today. You do not need to prove anything today. You just need to begin noticing what is true. Because when you move from vague to visible, you stop living on autopilot. You stop ignoring the quiet ache. You stop performing the disconnect. You stop performing a life that no longer fits. And little by little, you begin to hear yourself again. That's where clarity lives. That's where confidence begins. That is where your next chapter starts. So if you have been feeling like your life looks right, but feels wrong, I want you to know that you're not alone. You're not too late. You're not too much. And you're not the only woman who has reached a point where outward success is no longer enough. Sometimes the next chapter does not begin with a huge leap. Remember that. Sometimes it begins with one honest moment, just one. One quiet pause, one brave question, one decision to stop you ignoring yourself. And so if this episode gave words to something you have been feeling, hold on to that. Because the feeling is not the enemy. It may be the invitation. The invitation to stop performing, the invitation to start listening, the invitation to come home to yourself. And that is where everything begins to change. Thank you so much for listening. I invite you to connect with me so that you can start walking in your purpose with confidence. Until next time, this is Pamela E. Bloomfield, your transformational life coach, encouraging you, urging you, and supporting you to walk boldly into your next chapter. Connect with me. www.coachingyourgrowth.com. That's my website. Send me a DM and let me know that you're ready to start walking in your purpose with confidence. We'll talk later.